And you can all hear me well? Okay. So then I'll start. Thank you so much for this lovely invitation. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm kind of honored. I looked at the list of your previous speakers, and it's such an excellent list that I'm really glad to be a part of this series. Okay, so today I will talk about some of my recent work on cognitive control and motivation. So as humans, we have this remarkable ability to decide how we process the world around us and how we act within that world. And once we engage with a specific goal, it can feel as though everything around us disappears and we're solely focused on the task at hand. But we also have this remarkable ability to operate in environments that are constantly changing, where what we have to attend to and what our internal goals keep changing all the time. And these two abilities to engage with goals and flexibly switch between goals form what I think is the core of our human adaptiveness and intelligence. Basically, I will call this goal-directed cognition, and it is this ability to adjust which information we process and how we process it in accordance with our current goals. And when we think about this, we usually talk about cognitive control processes, which sort of classically you would think about the ability to direct top-down attention to goal-relevant information, or for example, to inhibit distractors, or switch between different tasks. And we usually kind of think of these as fixed abilities that we can measure with different tasks, for example, measuring switch costs or congruency effects that tell us something about our ability to inhibit distractors or move between different tasks. What I want to argue for in this talk is that this perspective, though very important, neglects a critical component of cognitive control, and that is the fact that this is a very dynamic set of processes. So what I mean by that is that we constantly adjust how we allocate and how much we allocate cognitive control. For example, we know that if we incentivize people more, they will pay more attention to the task at hand. If we give them different goals, for example, tell them that they really need to be accurate, they will sort of adjust their performance. We also know from a vast literature on cognitive control that after errors, people slow down and they become more cautious, or when they experience response conflict, their behavior changes. So I think a useful way to think about this is this concept of control state space, of the space of all possible control signals one can have. Imagine this as an abstract 2D space. And now you can think that for some goals, for example, that are not very important, we live somewhere here in the space, we need relatively little control. And for some other situations, we need to increase our cognitive control. And where we are in this control state will determine our performance on a given task. Somewhat simplistically, it will be better if we allocate more control, and we will perform worse if we allocate less control. So what I will try to do in this talk is show you how, if we take this perspective, this dynamical perspective on cognitive control, how we can reframe these two questions of how we engage with goals and how we flexibly switch between goals. Specifically, I will talk about how goal engagement processes depend on us figuring out where the optimal point in this space is, when we really need to be engaged and when we can still perform well without much resources. And then I will also talk about how people move through this space of control signals and what are the ensuing costs. Okay, so to make it a bit more concrete, we all know this example. We're sitting in our office, we're working on a paper or typing up an important email. And sometimes we will feel like this, like we're super focused, everything is going really well, we're typing away. But also sometimes for the exact same task, we'll feel like this. We'll be extremely distracted, won't be able to complete the task. So what determines cognitive control levels and this type of goal engagement? So I will start by casting cognitive control allocation as a decision-making problem. Specifically, I will start with the idea that we are rational bounded agents. So there are some costs to allocating control. Like the more control we allocate, we experience more cost in a way, simplistically. On the other hand, usually when we increase control, for example, top-down attention, our sort of ability to reach our outcomes kind of increases. And when those outcomes are more valuable, they will tend to beat the cost and will increase control. So how much we allocate depends on both the expected benefits and the expected costs of control. And then there is this one more component of motivation that I think is critical here. That is what I will call efficacy, which is basically what is the probability that I reach an outcome given the control signal that I have built. And to give you an intuition for this, in some environments, if I increase control, things will keep getting better, right? But I have some other environments that are less controllable. And I often like to think about writing grants, for example, where like how much effort you put in does not necessarily translate into obtaining the desired outcome, okay? And ones amongst you who are more familiar with RL can sort of see that I've caused this decision-making problem in reinforcement learning terms, right? Like we have some value of an outcome, we have some mapping between an action, which in this case is a signal, and the current state, right? And I have probability of obtaining the outcome, okay? So I want to cause cognitive control as this decision-making process where we weigh the costs and benefits of control. And what I will do in this talk is, first, I will talk about how people learn this efficacy component of motivation and how that guides cognitive control allocation. Then I will talk about how they also learn value and how they integrate these two components of motivation. And then I will talk about one potential way in which we can think about where costs of cognitive control come from. Okay, so let's delve in. So we have this example from real world of a chess player. And what the chess player has to do is to focus on his task and to sort of inhibit distractors in his environment, for example, people talking. And the sort of way we usually study this in the lab is kind of try to repeat this situation in very simplistic terms. We often use the Stroop task, which has these two dimensions. One is the distractor dimension, one is the target dimension. People need to focus on in color and ignore the distractor dimension. Okay, so this is the task we'll be using throughout. And we wanted to know in this study how people learn, how much efficacy they have within an environment, and how they adjust control based on that learning. So what we do is we present people with the Stroop task. It's just a classical Stroop. Before that, they get this neutral cue, just telling them the task is about to start. And then they get rewards. And they get rewards if they perform fast enough and they're accurate. But importantly, they also get feedback on whether those rewards were determined by their performance. So what I just said, whether they were correct and fast enough, or those rewards were random. So it looks something like this. When rewards are performance-based, they can either earn a reward or not, depending on their performance. But also, on some other trials, they will be informed that they got a random reward, meaning that this reward was independent of their performance. Importantly, we have this procedure where we equate reward rates between these performance-based and random rewards. So they have matched reward rates. The only thing that changes is whether the reward is due to their successful performance or to random chance. And so the critical manipulation is that over the trials in this experiment over time, we will modulate the probability that people are rewarded based on their performance or randomly. Meaning that, for example, someone will start here and they will have initially this period where rewards are mostly uncontrollable, so it's mostly random. Then they will have another period where it's 50-50 and another period where they have a lot of control over whether they can earn rewards. So in order to kind of have estimates of people's beliefs about whether their performance matters for obtaining rewards, we ask them every couple of trials for their subjective estimate. We ask them something like how much do you think your rewards currently depend on your performance? So now we have those subjective estimates every couple of trials. And the first thing we can do is to look at whether there is evidence of learning, whether these feedbacks modulate people's subjective experience. And we indeed see that they do. So the most recent feedback predicts their estimate of efficacy. And then as you move back in time, they predict less and less. So this is evidence of kind of dynamic belief updating. And what we can then do is we can fit a reinforcement learning model to get trial by trial estimates of this component of motivation. So essentially they get some feedback, then they give us their estimate, then they get other feedbacks, we get all of their estimates, and then we can fit a very simple reinforcement learning model that's learning to predict their subjective estimates based on the feedbacks with some learning rate. What that allows us to do is to have these trial by trial model-based estimates of efficacy that will look something like this for this one subject. Okay. So with that in hand, now we have on every trial people's beliefs about efficacy, and we think that that will determine how they allocate control and cognitive effort. Then they will get feedbacks, and then they will update their beliefs. So what we did is, because this was an EEG experiment, first we locked our analysis to processing of this efficacy feedback. And we looked at the P3B, which is kind of in reinforcement learning literature related to belief updating. So higher P3Bs usually means you're kind of making larger updates. And then we took our model-based prediction errors, the unsigned ones, so just meaning how surprised you were by this efficacy feedback. And we sort of show that the P3B is largest when people are really surprised. So you thought your control really doesn't matter. Now you got feedback telling you the opposite thing, and this is where you will update a lot. Okay, so we have evidence that people are doing kind of reinforcement learning, but on learning whether the environment is controllable. And then the question is whether this learning translates into different control allocation. So what we do here is we lock our analysis to this neutral cue that just signals that the trial is about to start. And we look at the CNV, the contingent negative variation, which is kind of a classical marker of proactive control allocation. When people expect higher rewards, they usually will see increased CNV, which is a negative component, so it will be more negative when people are allocating more proactive control. And indeed, what we see is now we can take these efficacy estimates on every trial and plot them against the CNV. And what we see is a positive relationship, negative because CNV is negative, meaning that people will allocate more cognitive control in parts of the experiment where they believe that currently they have a lot of control over whether they're getting rewards or not. And importantly, the CNV will also predict both reaction times and accuracy, meaning that people will also get better in the parts of the experiment where they think they have a lot of control. Okay, so this is showing that people can learn how much efficacy they have and that they adjust control allocation accordingly. Now I will briefly tell you about another set of experiments that I've done more recently, where people are integrating these two different components of motivation, whether control is worth it and whether it's worthwhile. So in this situation, the setup is very similar, and there is this drift of efficacy over time, but we now also put a drift on reward, on the probability that you can earn high versus low rewards, and these are kind of orthogonal, uncorrelated drifts over time. So what we can do then is we can get trial by trial estimates of efficacy and also trial by trial estimates of reward. So we have both of these components of motivation, and we're going to test whether these two are integrated to guide control allocation, as suggested by the model, because those two components are multiplied. So first I will look at behavior, and what I will do now is I'm plotting on the x-axis this trial by trial model-based efficacy estimate. So they are trial by trial belief on how much control they have. And then I will plot in color, just splitting between high versus low belief about whether you can earn more or less reward. So what we can see is when people think that they can earn high rewards, they speed up the more control they think they have, okay? So they're performing the best, the fastest, when they think they can earn high rewards, and those rewards really depend on their performance. However, when we look at low rewards, we don't see this effect, right? So there is an interaction here, meaning that people are integrating these components of motivation to drive how they behave. And we see the same thing in accuracy. We see the same type of interaction in accuracy, meaning that people are getting both faster and more accurate when they think they can earn a high reward, and it really depends on their behavior. So now I will briefly go back to this idea of control state space to say that, you know, when I started, I left it kind of abstract. Now I'll make it slightly less abstract, and then I will unpack it further in the second part of the talk. But let's imagine this control space, state space, as having attention on one of the dimensions, right? That's a very reasonable assumption. We sort of know that people can modulate how much attention they pay. And we can fit computational models from the family of sequential sampling models that kind of have a parameter that sort of corresponds to attention, meaning when you change this drift rate parameter, if you increase it, people will be both faster and more accurate, sort of similar to, you know, modulating signal to noise ratio via attention. So we can do that. We can fit the model to the data. And now I'm plotting drift rates predicted by efficacy and reward. And what you see is the same type of interaction, meaning that people have highest drift rates, basically allocating more attention to the task in situations where they think they can earn high rewards, and whether they earn them depends on them. Okay, so you see that interaction here. And then another dimension of the control state space that I will focus on is caution, right? So that's kind of an orthogonal dimension. You can be more or less cautious independently of, you know, how much attention you allocate. So we will use the caution parameter in the derivative diffusion model, usually called the response bound or threshold. And we will look at what happens with that parameter. And again, we see that people are integrating these components of motivation to determine this other control signal. And in this environment, because the sort of faster you go, you can accrue more rewards. The optimal thing to do is to basically reduce your threshold. And that's what people are doing. So when they think they can earn high rewards, and it really depends on them, they really lower their thresholds and they increase their drift rates, meaning that now they can go really fast because of a low level of threshold and caution, but they're allocating a lot of attention. So they're going both fast and they're being very accurate at the task. Okay, I will go back to derivative diffusion modeling and sort of unpack it more soon. So don't worry if this is still a bit abstract. Then finally, this is very brief because these are very preliminary results, and I'm working on them right now. So we had about 90 people complete this task. And out of those, we had 36 complete the task in an fMRI scanner. So we can look at a couple of things. We have these model-based estimates of motivation. We have recordings in the scanner, and we have these models, right? So what we can do is model-based fMRI. We can take trial-by-trial estimates of motivation and sort of look at both learning mechanisms and control allocation mechanisms. So first of all, what we see in like very preliminary analysis is that we see classical reward prediction errors. So signed RPEs are sort of activating the regions we would expect, for example, the basal ganglia here. So our kind of model-based analysis is making sense. That's sort of a sanity check. Further, what we're really interested in here is this idea of, are you learning reward values and whether rewards are controllable in sort of distinct regions and then integrating that information? And we're starting to see some evidence that that is the case, that you can dissociate sort of learning, looking at model-based prediction errors for efficacy and for reward separately. And then finally, what we see, which sort of parallels behavior, In behavior, we saw that people integrate those two types of information to drive their behavior. And what we're seeing here is that the lateral prefrontal cortex, which is kind of classically related, whose activity is classically related to allocating more or less cognitive control, we see that the activity in LPFC is driven by the interaction of these two components of motivation on sort of trial by trial basis. Okay. So what I've shown you so far is evidence that people sort of care about these two different components of motivation, and they integrate them to determine how much cognitive control they allocate. And I've shown you that they can learn both of these components of motivation via learning based on prediction errors, and that they will use integrated, sort of integrating these components of motivation to determine control allocation. But I've so far neglected this question of where the cost comes from. And now I will talk about the most recent work I have on sort of trying to understand how these control dynamics and moving in the space of possible control signals can generate costs. So going back to this example, we often do some tasks that require very high levels of focus and precision. For example, writing a manuscript, responding to reviewers, or something like that. But then we also do tasks that are very similar. They sort of require typing and reading, but that demand way less focus and precision, such as scrolling Twitter before we start writing our paper. And when we go back to this idea of control state space, we can sort of think of these different goals living in different parts of this space. So for example, scrolling Twitter demands pretty minimal levels of attention and caution. Then we sort of need to start, really start working because we've spent too much time. And the idea is that we need to travel through this space. We need to slowly adjust. And what we do in this work is develop a model of how those adjustment dynamics look like. And the core idea of the model is that you can get costs just due to dynamics because people are slow when they move from one state to another state. So there is some inertia in the control system where you cannot instantly jump from, I'm on Twitter and I don't care, to I really, really need to focus, right? There is some inertia, and that will generate performance costs because it will take us time to reach the control state that is optimal for our new goal. So we could think of at least a part of these costs as arising purely due to dynamics, cognitive control dynamics, without any sort of hardwired costs. So the way we do this in the lab is give people different goals when they perform cognitively demanding tasks. So they will always perform the same task, but in one case, we'll tell them, just do this as fast as possible. You don't have to care about accuracy. And in another setting, we will tell them, it's really important that you perform this as accurately as you can. And the idea is that these different goals move people in this space, right? They have optimal solutions in different parts of this control space. Of course, we always suffer from this problem that unlike, for example, motor control states are not directly observable, right? So we need some sort of a process model, and this is the drift diffusion model I already mentioned that has these two components, drift rate and threshold, that we focus on. And just as a brief refresher, so these are sequential sampling models with the idea that you can cast any decision-making problem as noisy sampling of evidence towards one of the possible decisions, right? So you kind of are getting some samples of evidence at arbitrary time points, and that is pushing you slowly towards one response bound or another response bound. Drift rate parameterizes the speed of the accumulation of evidence, and response bounds or thresholds sort of parameterize how much evidence you need in order to commit a response. So that's the kind of caution parameter. And importantly, they have dissociable effects on response time distributions, meaning that drift rates usually will lead to faster reaction times and more accurate responses because you're more efficient at sampling. Whereas increasing thresholds will lead to more accurate responses, but slower reaction times. That's why this model is identifiable. Okay, so we will use that model to kind of specify this two-dimensional control state space. So we will replace these kind of broad notions of attention and caution for these different goals with drift rates and thresholds. And we will say that there is some notion of optimal control intensity. So you're in some current state, for example, the Twitter state, and now you need to switch and you have a new target state. So we use a pretty simple delta rule here to specify how these dynamics look like, meaning that the sort of change in control signals and in arbitrary time units will be proportional to the distance between the current state and the target state. But critically, you won't be able in this model to just jump from one state to another, but you have this tau parameter, which sort of specify the speed at which you will move between these control states. And this model will give you dynamics that look like this. So imagine that this is your starting drift rate, and this is your target drift rate for the new task. So you will get these kind of exponentially saturating dynamics as you move towards your goal. And the critical intuition for this model is that once I give you the new goal, you will start moving, but then at some point the task will start and you will have to implement whatever you have at that moment. So you will not necessarily reach your target state due to these slow dynamics in inertia in control adjustments. And once the task starts, you will sort of implement whatever you have. So you will give a response with the drift rate and the threshold that you currently have. So this model gives several predictions that we went and tested across a couple of studies. So the first one is that switches between goals will induce these types of costs. What I mean by that is, imagine that you have this speed and accuracy goal. You will have some distance in the space between them when you are only ever doing one or the other. However, if I put you in the block, in a classical task switching situation where you have to move between blocks, so that will be in fixed blocks. And then if I put varying blocks, your performance on them will be pooled closer together. Why? Because now you're constantly having to travel between these, and there is some inertia in the system. So there will be many trials on which you won't reach your optimal target state. So these states will be kind of pooled closer together on varying compared to fixed blocks. And the amount of that pool will be what we will use as control adjustment cost, right? The amount of that cost will sort of be modulated by either the environment or the speed at which you can move. So that's the first prediction. That just says people are not able to jump from one control state to another control state, but they slowly travel. The other straightforward prediction is that these costs will be larger with larger distance between control states, right? So if you're moving between like Twitter and cooking dinner, it's not like a super large jump. But if you need to move from Twitter to writing a paper, it's a large distance, right? And the cost should scale with that distance. Further, if there are these dynamics over time, the costs should increase when people don't have a lot of time to adjust, right? So the less time they have to adjust, basically if we're cutting them at different points, the more cost they will have. And then finally, these costs should also increase the more you have to switch between different goals. Okay, so we wanted to have a task in which people have to adjust these control states, but they don't have to adjust anything else. So they don't have to adjust like stimulus response mappings to keep it really clean. So they will just get this queue, they will have some time in between the queue, and then they will perform a couple of Stroop trials. They'll have like a fixed time interval of like 8 seconds. They can do as many trials as they want. They'll get feedback, and that's it. They will do this under either the accuracy or the speed goal. And they will perform this in either fixed blocks that don't have any adjustment costs, or varying blocks in which there are high costs of adjusting control. So this is the first study. And here I'm plotting reaction times in fixed blocks for speed and accuracy. And you can see that there is about 150 millisecond difference between these. These are confidence intervals. So people are definitely, doing this task. They're way faster in the speed condition. But then critically, when we look at these varying blocks, we see that the performance in varying blocks is kind of pulled towards the other condition. So when you're in the speed goal, but you're constantly moving between the speed and accuracy goal, you're actually slower in the speed goal, okay? Suggesting you're kind of closer in the state space to the accuracy goal. There is a similar trend here, but I think there's ceiling effects. And then we see the same thing in accuracy, right? Kind of like paradoxically, if you think about it from the mixing cost perspective, people are actually doing better in speed on varying blocks, right? Because of this pull towards the accuracy, and the same thing happening here. Like people are worse in accuracy blocks in varying compared to fixed. We can then take our model and we can simulate what this would look like. So the model would say, in fixed blocks, here you would be for speed, here for accuracy. And then in varying blocks, purely due to sort of the time that you need, so we just give to the model the structure of the trials that participants experience. And the model predicts, there will be this pool in varying blocks, so there will be a control adjustment costs. Then we can fit a DDM model. And what we show is that indeed our participants display this type of behavior. So there is this pool that in the control state space, these states are closer when people have to move between the two goals. I will also just briefly show you this second study. So in order to test the idea of distance, to test distance, you need at least like 3 points in space. So we added one more goal, which is try to be really fast and accurate. People end up empirically placing themselves somewhere in between the two goals for the speed and accuracy one, actually. So the model then predicts that you will get a large cost, like a large pool between these distant states, but you will get smaller pools between these states that are closer together, right? Because you have to travel less distance. And indeed, we replicate our first result. So we see this pool. So there is a control adjustment costs in varying blocks. But importantly, for these in-between speed and accuracy ones, we see less of a pool. And we even see like basically no pool in between these states that are really close together, more when they're slightly further apart, and really large for these really distant control states. Okay, so to wrap up, this is a preprint we just posted. We sort of have 4 experiments and almost 200 people participating across them. And first, we show the existence of these control adjustment costs. Now here, I'm just plotting the change in distance between these points across fixed and varying blocks. So the demand to switch between control states induces performance costs. Then we also show that those costs scale with distance. So they increase the higher distance is between states that you have to travel between. Then we also show that time modulates this. So essentially, you can remove at least part of this cost if you give people enough time to travel in the control space. And those costs increase the less time they have for adjustment. And then finally, we also showed that switch frequency modulates these costs, meaning that when you're switching with very low frequency, you don't get much of a cost. But as you increase the number of switches, that's where you start seeing these costs emerge. So just to sum up, I've sort of shown you now that some of these costs can emerge not because there are some hardwired costs in our brain, but because of the structure of our environment, which produces the need to frequently move between different control states. And these control states not defined by what you need to attend to and which action you take, as in classical task switching, but these more kind of meta control states of how focused you are on a task, no matter what the concrete task is. So when you operate in these environments in which you frequently need to adjust how focused you are or how cautious you are, you start observing those costs. And those costs can arise purely due to inertia and control adjustments. And they depend on the distance between control states, on the time you have to move, and on the frequency of the switches. And I think that these costs are also maybe particularly interesting for understanding sort of work performance, because when you think, for example, what doctors do every day or surgeons, is you move between these states that demand extremely high levels of attentional focus and caution, such as operating. And then you move to performing like really dumb admin tasks, right? Which require a really large shift. And then you go back to surgery, right? And we sort of show, at least in the lab, that these kinds of situations can produce pretty large costs. And now I will just use the last couple of minutes to tell you a bit about how thinking about cognitive control as this dynamical set of processes that have this notion of optimality and decision-making can actually help us understand individual differences in cognitive control, and in particular, the pathology of control. So I've talked so far about these situations where we decide to engage with a goal and that are pretty positive, meaning that, the goals are more valuable and we allocate more control and we're performing better. But we actually know that cognitive control is one of the hallmarks of many mental disorders, in particular, mood disorders such as depression, and also schizophrenia. So this is one of the kind of cognitive markers of these disorders. And I've done work during my PhD kind of trying to understand how we can think about where these cognitive control deficits come from. Like, why do they come about in psychopathology? And the sort of classical view of this is that if you're depressed or you have schizophrenia, you just have reduced ability to exert cognitive control, right? Like when we measure that in patients and compare, for example, congruency effects, we see that people have reduced ability to allocate cognitive control. They perform worse on Stroop tasks. They have larger congruency effects and stuff like that. However, the question of why this happens was pretty open, and people are kind of searching for like hardware problems in the brain. But if you take this dynamical perspective and the perspective of decision making, what you actually get is when you decompose what determines how much cognitive control and cognitive effort people put within a certain environment, you can kind of start seeing how these links between motivation, learning, and cognitive control emerge. So, for example, imagine that you're depressed and you have automatic negative thoughts all the time, right? And you're trying to control them. You're trying to exert control and suppress those thoughts. But you sort of start seeing that no matter how hard you try to suppress them, you still have them. So that would be like reduced outcome controllability, which could lead to learning that allocating control is not really worth the cost. You can think in similar ways of devaluation of outcomes that often happens with anhedonia symptomatology, either in depression or schizophrenia. And you could also think of potentially increased costs. So what this perspective allows us to do is to offer a mechanistic potential understanding of where the deficits come about, where changes in different components of motivation sort of change how people invest their cognitive resources across different environments and situations. And then finally, thinking about goal flexibility, I kind of said that people have this remarkable ability to quickly move between control states or change their task sets. But we also know that people can often be really rigid and inflexible. And one sort of where we often see that is with aging, right? Sort of classically measured by task switch costs, for example, people get less and less flexible as they move towards older age. And we've started doing this work on looking at how people move between these meta control states as they age. So this is now a new experiment, kind of taking a group of younger adults, like up to 30-year-olds, looking at these fixed blocks and sort of seeing what I've shown you before. Then we take a group of older adults, so people over 65, and we show that they display the same behavior in fixed blocks. There's actually these overall shifts that are well known in the literature that people, the older you are, you essentially have higher thresholds. People become more cautious. That's a very well known result. But critically for us, when we look at the distance between these states, we don't see any difference between young adults and older adults, right? So there's some overall shifts, but the distance in the space between two control states is the same. But then critically, when we look at these varying blocks, we again replicate our results in younger adults, but in older adults, we now see a really, really large pool. So we actually see a 4 times higher cost, meaning the sort of change in distance between fixed and varying blocks. So even though the sort of overall distance is the same, the speed at which they travel in this meta control space is way reduced. And we have some ideas on how sort of neuromodulatory changes across age could contribute to these types of dynamics. Okay, so I will sort of end with repeating that we have this beautiful ability to engage with our goals and forget about anything else. And both extremely good performance of their arts use that ability, but we also use that ability in everyday life, engaging with the goal of grabbing a coffee with a friend, then switching to another goal of going back to work and sending emails. What I've tried to show you in this talk is that how we engage with our different goals critically depends on these control states. And they serve this purpose of enabling us to act adaptively in our environments as our environments change and as our internal goals change. Critically, how we engage with each of our goals depends on these components of motivation that move us around in this space of possible control states. And levels of goal engagement are dynamically adjusted. So we have these empirical ways now to move around people in how engaged they are with their current goal by changing levels of motivation, for example, outcome controllability or efficacy or reward value. Further, I've also shown you that the sort of one often overlooked aspect of goal flexibility is this ability to adjust your meta control states. And I've shown you work showing that we can understand this process by just assuming that there is some inertia in moving between different control states. And finally, I think that this, rather than thinking about cognitive control as a fixed ability that differs across people, thinking about it as a dynamical process that depends on motivation and learning also allows us to answer potentially some of the questions of when and how cognitive control goes awry in psychopathology, or for example, in aging. And it allows us critically to invert this question of, instead of looking for where exactly is the inability, so for example, Is it the inhibition? Is it the inhibition of negative material? Is it shifting attention away from negative material? Instead of looking for where that inability is, it allows us to invert the question, ask a new question of why is this type of control allocation in this patient optimal given their learning history and given their components of motivation or their motivation levels. And with that, I would like to thank my postdoc mentor, Amitai Shenhav, my PhD mentors and supervisors, Ernst Koster and Ruth Krebs, all of my collaborators, Romy Fromer and Mahalia Prater-Fahey worked with me on the learning of efficacy project, and Xiaomin Lang worked with me on the sort of control adjustment costs projects. Sebastian Muslik has been a dear co-author on many papers, and Dana Ogba and Yuan Dog have helped a lot with collecting data for a lot of these studies. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention and motivation.